My name's Jacob Verghese, and I'm the CEO of Maurice Blackburn, but I'm also Director of Per Capita, and very pleased to be welcoming you here today to hear the Shadow Treasurer speak about inequality. Before we get started, would like to recognise the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, which are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and otherwise welcome you to Maurice Blackburn, who are very proud to be associated with this event because it's an interest of ours to promote social justice and reduce inequality in society. And it's also a focus of Per Capita. Per Capita made a decision last year to put inequality at the centre of all of the work we're doing from a research perspective. And we also made a very important decision last year to change our chair and CEO. And so I'm pleased to welcome our new chair, Helen Conway, who's sitting in the front row, and also all the other directors of Per Capita who are here today. And also pleased to welcome to the stage to introduce Mr. Bowen, Emma Dawson, who's our new CEO, who has, in the 6 months or so that she's been working for us, made a massive contribution. And we're really excited to have her on board. So without any further ado, I'll introduce you to Emma.
Thanks, Jacob, for those kind and unexpected words. Thank you, everybody, for coming here today to hear from the Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen. You've probably seen a little coverage already this morning of his speech. I've read it and it's a cracker, so I'm not going to delay things any further other than to say thank you and please welcome Chris Bowen.
Well, thanks very much. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank them for their stewardship of our country over 40,000 years and commit myself as Alternative Treasurer to the task of eradicating the unacceptable scourge of Indigenous disadvantage in our country. And thank you to Per Capita and to Maurice Blackburn for hosting us today. Per Capita has become a very important progressive contributor to the public policy debate in Australia. And Maurice Blackburn, of course, fights for fair. So they're both very suitable hosts for us, this speech on inequality. Throughout the developed world, the 20th century was a period of great advance for a better, fairer society. This was not inevitably the case. The aftermath of the Industrial Revolution saw ordinary people thrown into horrible workplaces for a pittance of a wage, while a small number of owners of capital amassed great wealth. Not for nothing was it known as the Gilded Age, gilded for a few. But then governments acted, unions were formed, workplace laws were introduced, taxes were made progressive, a welfare safety net was introduced. The emergence of strong Labor and social democratic parties were essential drivers of this change. But now, after a century of progress, it's no exaggeration or hyperbole to say that many of these gains are at risk in the developed world. In the United States, for example, in 1915, the richest 1% of the population received 18% of national income. Government action and union organisations saw this figure reduce over the 20th century. But the late 20th and early 21st centuries have seen attacks on organised unionism and a retreat from active government. And a new industrial revolution has seen massive rises in automation and a hollowing out of middle-income jobs. So now, in the United States, the richest 1% receive 24% of national income, more than in 1915. Now, every country is different, and in Australia, we've got much right. But even here, we've seen wealth grow more quickly at the top. As my colleague Andrew Lee has shown, since the late 1970s, the wealth share of the top 1% has risen from 7% in 1978 to 11% in 2010. Now, while we can talk about the varying degrees everywhere, the trend is the same across the developed world, and this matters. If we care about the advancement of the greater good, the maximisation of happiness and dignity for as many possible, this matters. If we care about a sense of society, of the majority benefiting from progress, this matters. And if we care about avoiding a sense of disillusion, of disenfranchisement, which sees people who are missing out turning to simplistic solutions of populism and closed borders, this matters. Over the course of the last 12 months, I've made a series of speeches about things important to me as Alternative Treasurer, as I go about thinking about and laying out the economic plans of the next Labor government. Things that will be important to me as Treasurer. The case for opportunity, the case for openness, the case for the middle class, the case for innovation, the case for Australia and Indonesia. And today I want to build on the themes of some of these earlier speeches and make the case for action on inequality. I don't just want to talk about the problem, I want to make the case for activist policy to counter rising inequality. Now this isn't easy and it will be controversial, but it must be done. Hand-wringing and glib one-liners about all Australians being in it together won't cut it when Australians know that the current situation isn't working and is getting worse. I also want to outline some principles which should underpin policy action on countering inequality. Action should be bold, but carefully designed. We don't face a choice between growth and equality. Properly designed policies which promote fairness can also engender growth. As the IMF has said, and I quote, "We find that increasing the income share of the poor and the middle class actually increases growth, while a rising income share of the top 20% results in lower growth. That is, when the rich get richer, the benefits do not trickle down." However, poorly designed policies can inhibit growth and be counterproductive to enhancing growth. They can have unintended consequences, and when policies which promote fairness backfire with unintended consequences, it puts the progressive cause backwards, not forwards. So let me deal with 4 policy principles which should underpin action to tackle inequality. First, do no harm. Second, make tax more progressive. Thirdly, care about geographic disadvantage. And finally, education, education, education. Let me deal with each of these in turn. First, do no harm. With inequality on the rise, the first duty of government is not to make inequality worse. This might appear to be a given, a motherhood statement which doesn't need to be made. I wish it was so. Because policies that are being pursued by the government as we speak will make inequality worse. Of course, it was only until very recently that the government was pursuing harsh cuts to family payments, stripping unemployed people of any living allowance and cuts to the age pension. It's hard to think of other policies that would just further entrench poverty and disadvantage in areas around the country as much as those. But the most striking current example is penalty rates. Wages growth is at record lows, and living standards, or real net disposable income per capita, has fallen for 4 years consecutively through to 2016, the longest prolonged fall since records began in the 1970s. And the government thinks the answer to this problem is cutting wages. Now yes, cutting penalty rates was recommended by the Fair Work Commission, and overturning Commission rulings should not be done lightly. It's not being done lightly by Labor. But let's be clear, governments can and do overturn court and tribunal decisions when the government of the day feels strongly enough about it. The government is seeking, as we speak, to overturn a federal court decision on native title because it doesn't like it. The same government overturned a decision of the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal when it didn't like it. The problem is the government is actually comfortable with the decision to reduce penalty rates. Well, we are not. People who are on penalty rates in the hospitality and retail sectors are low-income earners. This isn't a trade-off where workers get a higher base rate in return for compensation and greater flexibility. It's a pay cut for low-income earners. It'll make inequality worse. It should be reversed, and the Labor government will reverse it. A similar point can be made about the minimum wage. Some want to see the minimum wage abolished. Or, looking back at the Liberal government's Commission of Audit, which recommended indexing the minimum wage at a rate less than CPI, see it go backwards. Or to put another way, create an Australian working poor. Of course the minimum wage should be maintained. If we want to ensure we stave off a complete hollowing out of the middle class like we've seen in the United States, we need to defend our minimum wage with passion. But we must also recognise that people reliant on the minimum wage have been sharing less in our nation's prosperity. 20 years ago, the minimum wage was 63% of the median wage. Now it's 53%. The decline in the minimum wage relative to the wage of a typical worker has no doubt been a driver of the increase in inequality in Australia. From 1975 to 2014, real wages increased by 72% for the top 10% of income earners, but by just 23% for the bottom 10% of income earners. Over the last decade, Australia is only one of 4 OECD nations in which the minimum wage relative to average wage has declined, and our decline is the largest in the OECD. And while the most recent decision of the Fair Work Commission to increase the minimum wage above inflation is welcome, minimum wage increases have generally not kept pace with productivity increases, and penalty rates are being cut at exactly the same time. In fact, new OECD analysis shows that the gap between productivity and worker pay in Australia is one of the widest of all advanced countries. If we want people to work harder, we need to ensure that they share in our economic gains. Recent trends certainly don't inspire optimism when the government tells people just to trust them that their corporate tax cut for big business will magically trickle down into ordinary people's pay packets. And whilst the minimum wage will continue to be set by the Fair Work Commission, having a government that actually believes in a strong minimum wage and is happy to argue for it before the Commission will, I think, be important in protecting and enhancing it. This brings me to my second point, the progressivity of the tax system. Of course, Australia does have a progressive taxation system, but in the face of increasing inequality of incomes, making the tax system less progressive would be a backward step, and improving the fairness of the tax system should be a key priority. One of the most important things we can do is carefully and systematically reduce tax concessions in the system which are no longer fit for purpose and which are regressive. And that's exactly the approach we've taken from opposition and will take in government. For example, 50% of the benefit of negative gearing goes to the top 10% of income earners. 70% of the benefit of the capital gains tax concession goes to the top 10% of income earners. 30% of the superannuation concession benefit goes to the top 10% of income earners. All have been regressive elements of our tax system for some time, and in some circumstances allowing people on high incomes to reduce their taxable income to zero. It's hard to believe that a government faced with a deficit 10 times as large as it forecast in its 2014 budget would leave many of these concessions untouched, and yet they have. On its own, the capital gains tax discount is expected to grow by 18% over the forward estimates to total $13 billion in annual revenue forgone by 2020-21. This leaves ordinary, pay-as-you-go workers to shoulder more of the burden of budget repair, which is why all of these will be reformed by a shortened Labor government and more. We'll continue to work through areas of the tax system that can't be justified on fairness grounds and left untouched, reduce the integrity of the tax base. Areas of the tax system that allow people to reduce their average tax bills through means unavailable to those without the resources to do so. And our latest announcement to cap the amount that people can claim as a tax deduction for managing their tax affairs will have a smaller impact on the budget than these other reforms, but is the next iteration of our careful plans to make the taxation system fairer. In 2015, 48 Australians with an income of more than $1 million reduced their taxable incomes to zero. 19 of these people used the deduction of managing their tax affairs as the primary method of doing so. There's something particularly galling about using payments to accountants and lawyers, with all due respect, to minimise tax as a deduction as a way of eradicating the tax paid. The public reaction to these issues is getting stronger, and rightly so. Of course, using an accountant to do your tax is perfectly legitimate, but the average deduction for managing your tax affairs is just $378, which is why our policy of capping the tax deductibility of managing tax affairs at $3,000 will affect less than 1% of taxpayers, but will improve the fairness of the taxation system. Now, of course, high-income people can pay as much as they want to accountants and lawyers to manage their tax affairs. We won't stop that, but only the first $3,000 a year will be subsidised by other taxpayers, and that's fair. This brings me to tax rates. Under the Abbott-Turnbull government, our tax system is less, not more progressive. They talk about lower personal tax. Well, let's take a quick look at the record. Their first act in personal tax was to cancel the plans of the previous Labor government to lift the tax-free threshold from $18,200 to $19,200. Then last year, they provided tax relief to Australians earning more than $80,000. This year, they took the tax cut back with their proposal to increase the Medicare levy. Last year's tax cut cost the budget $4 billion. This year's tax rise will make $8 billion. But of course, we're talking about different people. When the Turnbull government was delivering tax cuts, they targeted people earning more than $80,000 a year. But when they deliver tax rises, they target people earning more than $21,000 a year. And then there's the deficit levy. It's striking that all the measures in the 2014 budget that targeted low-income earners were permanent. Cuts to the pension, making unemployed people wait for New Start, cuts to family payments, all were permanent. The government didn't say to low and middle income earners, listen, times are tough, we need you to make a contribution, but when we're back in surplus, we'll restore these cuts. That wasn't the policy. The only temporary measure in the 2014 budget was the only one which impacted on high income earners. It's not enough for the government to shrug its shoulders and say the deficit levy is coming off because it was temporary. The budget deficit is now 10 times bigger than it was projected to be when the deficit levy came in. The deficit levy shouldn't be the only budget consolidation measure that is temporary. Lifting of the deficit levy will rob the budget of $6 billion over the next 4 years. On its own, it provides a $16,400 a year tax cut to someone earning $1 million on the 1st of July this year, while up to 700,000 workers will have their penalty rates cut the very next day. And yet the government wants to make someone earning just $60,000 pay $300 a year more in tax. So the contrast is clear. Both sides of politics will now go to the next election promising increases in personal tax, quite unusual in our recent history. But here's the difference. The government's tax increase will apply to all Australians earning more than $21,000. Labor's will apply to Australians earning more than $87,000. The government wants to make the tax system less progressive. Labor wants to make it more progressive. The government's plan also has the effect of taking money off people that typically spend a higher proportion of their post-tax incomes. This has the potential to act as a drag on consumption and the broader macroeconomy. National accounts data this week showed that we have an economy which is growing at its slowest rate in 8 years, underpinned by pretty mediocre consumption, something which is made worse under this government's approach. In the face of falling real wages and increasing inequality, our plan is the superior one. It raises more money, is fairer and is better suited to economic conditions. I now want to turn to the matter of rural and regional inequality. Any discussion about inequality in Australia which doesn't deal with geographic inequality is missing a key part of the issue. Where you live has a big impact on your quality of life. And just as income inequality is at very elevated levels, there's no evidence that geographic inequality is reducing, quite the contrary. For example, half of all jobs created in Australia in the last decade have been created within 2 kilometres of either the Sydney or the Melbourne GPO, here, where we are. Half of all jobs created in this tiny geographic area compared to the massive landmass of Australia. The inner parts of cities, people see low unemployment rates and high levels of job creation. Here where we are in New South Wales, inner city, the unemployment rate sits at around 4%, with the youth unemployment rate at 8%, while in areas like New England, the unemployment rate sits at 7% and youth unemployment sits at closer to 14%. It's not to say, of course, there's no disadvantage in cities. Of course there is. But the further you move away from cities, there's no denying that there are less economic opportunities. And the government has no answers. Their regional strategy is to move one government agency from Canberra to Armidale. That's it, at great cost to taxpayers and efficiency. Now, while considering locating new organisations or government operations in rural and regional areas can play a modest role in regional development, in the absence of a broader strategy, random decentralisations like this are just a boondoggle. A boondoggle for just one town which happens to be in Barnaby Joyce's electorate. Now, geographic specific policies can and must play a role. Labor created the Regional Development Australia Agency, a model which recognises that local communities are well placed to identify the opportunities for growth. I want to concentrate on 2 particular elements of the policy response to geographic disadvantage today. Firstly, innovation. We used to hear a lot about innovation. It used to be an exciting time to be an Australian. Now it's not, apparently. But innovation remains a key part of our policy development. And I have a particular focus on innovation as part of a regional development policy. Many of Australia's universities now have a regional presence, following the Dawkins reforms of the 1980s. And these universities are often working on solutions to challenges and opportunities which exist in these communities. But we need to do much more. That's the beauty of the policy that Labor took to the last election for regional innovation hubs. This included establishing a regional innovation fund to kickstart initiatives to expand the role of Australia's regions in contributing to the national innovation effort. And Labor's plan for a start-up year, which would have encouraged the entry of around 2,000 graduate-level enterprises a year, supporting ongoing regionally led innovation. This plan also included the commitment of establishing 20 new accelerators, partnering with a regional university or TAFE, local governments and a local business chamber. We're seeing the emergence of a sharper regional focus from within the startup community. I've seen it myself. It's evidenced through initiatives like Silicon Paddock, through to what we're seeing at Runway Geelong. It's important that the private sector and government work closely on these sorts of initiatives. Earlier this week, I was in Bathurst, where they're doing the right thing, thinking about how they can transition a simple car racing facility into a high-technology, job-creating precinct called Velocity Park. I've also been impressed with the Rise of the Rest initiative in the United States, entirely private sector-led, which actively looks to regional economies, especially those who are doing it tough, and funds new and innovative projects. To quote their mission, high-growth companies can now start and scale anywhere, not just in a few coastal cities. A determination that innovation won't emerge exclusively out of the laneways of inner cities, but will also call up the talents and smarts of those located in our regions who want to generate new jobs and firms that will endure the changes ahead. And secondly, and closely linked, education, particularly in this case, vocational education and training. We have a mismatch in our regional areas. It struck me for a long time that we have a problem when areas of high youth unemployment, for example, are areas of good industries with skill shortages. Take Cairns, for example. Cairns has a youth unemployment rate of more than 20%, and yet it has a vibrant tourism sector desperate for well-trained workers. As Bill Shorten announced in his budget reply speech, that's why Labor will create a $100 million Building TAFE fund, Building TAFE for the Future. To renovate classrooms, workshops, kitchens and ag science centres, we'll deliver world-class facilities for a world-class training system. And this rebuilding work will begin where it's needed the most, in areas of high youth unemployment around the country, and that means regional areas. And this brings me to my final point about education more broadly. Lifting our educational achievement is a vital economic imperative for our country. And closing the gap of educational disadvantage is a social justice imperative. The evidence is clear. Educational disadvantage linked to the socio-economic status of parents is a bigger factor in Australia than is the average in the developed world, and this is unacceptable. Low-income students are on average 2.5 years behind high-income students in terms of attainment. Indigenous students are also 2.5 years behind non-Indigenous students. Remote students are 2 years behind metropolitan students. This is also unacceptable. With income inequality at 75-year highs, surely we must be more concerned than ever about the fact that our education system entrenches disadvantage rather than ameliorating it. Increasing the quantum of education funding is important, but a proper and genuine needs-based system is just as important. And a good quality vocational education and lifelong learning system is more important than ever before. It's hard to express it better than Andrew McPhee and Eric Brynjolfsson, who said, "There's never been a better time to be a worker with special skills or the right education, because these people can use these skills to create and capture value. And there's never been a worse time to be a worker with ordinary skills and abilities to offer, because computers, robots and other digital technologies are acquiring these skills and abilities at an extraordinary rate." Again, I see our commitment to properly funded public vocational education as vital in our efforts to reduce inequality. As Bill Shorten said in his budget reply speech, Australia's future lies in human capital, in skills, education and training. In this rapidly changing time, we need a government that recognises technology is having a huge impact on our economy, and an equal one, hollowing out jobs and increasing inequality. A concerted national effort to produce a better, more efficient and more effective vocational education sector is the key. Now, I've outlined today some ideas and principles that will underpin my approach to inequality as Treasurer. But I'll also take a few moments to deal with ideas that have been considered but don't warrant implementation. I have already outlined that Labor's developed in the last few years a progressive tax policy, the most progressive policy we've had from an opposition in generations, and will continue this work carefully and methodically to avoid unintended consequences. The debate about inequality is filled with people of goodwill. trying to think of innovative solutions. But that doesn't mean that every idea is a good one. Take, for example, universal basic income. It's suggested that with technology on the march, we can no longer expect people to find and retain work, and we should provide a universal basic income from the state to all, regardless of work. Now, while I understand the factors which motivate this call, it's the wrong answer. Firstly, we are the Labor Party. We believe in work and in the value of work. As has been said in the UK, the clue is in our name. We must never give up on the mission of ensuring dignity through work for Australians. It would also be wrong in detail in the Australian context. One of the most important elements of Australia's policy framework is our highly targeted welfare system. Widespread means testing means that we get greater bang for the buck for poverty alleviation out of every dollar spent in welfare. A universal basic income would be just that, universal, providing payments to millionaires but at a considerable cost to the taxpayer, and payments that would barely be noticed by people of considerable means. And it would be very impractical. Peter Whiteford from the Crawford School of Economics has shown that if we abolished all existing payments to pay for a universal basic income and put in place an $8,000 universal payment supplemented by an extra payment for those on low incomes, it would equate to around $13,000 a year. For anyone on government support like the age pension or a disability allowance, this would mean a savage cut. It's hard to think of one single policy area that would take income inequality backwards as much as this. Others have argued that a universal basic income should be paid for by increasing taxes rather than reducing payments, but that doesn't work either. So we wanted a universal basic income to match the pension at $20,000. As Peter Whiteford has found, this would have to be the starting point. But after abolishing all other welfare payments, it would still require an extra $210 billion in taxes, a 50% increase on the current level of tax collected in Australia. A universal basic income would present us with a rare and unattractive policy trade-off, making us more unequal as a society and delivering us an unsustainable tax system at the same time. There are plenty of good things we can do to take action on inequality. Many of them are already in Labor policy. None of them have been easy, all controversial, but all worthwhile. We have enough worthwhile things to do without contemplating bad ideas. But as I say, I understand the sentiment behind calls for a universal basic income. Those sentiments are well intended, but it's not part of the policy solution. We pride ourselves in Australia on being the land of the fair go, and with good cause. But we must defend the hard-fought gains of a fairer society over the last century. We need to continue to grow our economy and expand the pie. But if an increasing proportion of our economy is being consumed by fewer and fewer people, both our economy and our society suffer. We can't just identify the problem. We need to offer policy solutions. The alternative is to say the problem exists and to do nothing about it. We have to offer policy solutions in the Labor tradition and then implement them as the agenda of a reforming Labor government. We've been developing the policy solutions from opposition, and we have more to do between now and the next election. And then I look forward to implementing them in Labor budgets, improving the fairness and equity of Australian society, also in the great tradition of Labor. Thank you very much.
Chris, thanks very much. There's a lot in that speech, a lot that resonates with us at Per Capita, with our focus on inequality in particular. We also have a new approach to the reports we do where we'll be putting a regional lens over everything, because I think it's a really important and often overlooked task by think tanks in Australia who tend to be quite urban focused. Before I throw to a few questions for the Shadow Treasurer, I will alert the room and the Shadow Treasurer himself that the annual Per Capita Tax Survey will be out next week. And there were findings in that, I think, that will warm your heart. Certainly, Australians do feel that our society is at risk of becoming more unequal. The findings this year showed that around 2/3 of Australians want to see high-income Australians pay more tax. and about 87% of Australians think that corporate tax evasion is skewing our tax system in an unfair direction. The other really great news is that we now have around 2/3 of Australians who support restricting or abolishing negative gearing. Very strong support for restrictions, and I think that a lot of credit goes to you and Bill Shorten for leading that debate and taking something that was previously seen as untouchable and have really persuaded people of that idea. Anyway, I'm going to throw to some questions from the floor. Anne, would you like to? I saw you with your hand up there. We'll just get a mic.
Thanks. Hi, Chris, and great speech, thank you. I've got two questions. The first on tax reform. It's one of those issues that everybody says from opposition, we're going to fix it. And then something happens when you get back into government that interest groups, I guess, turn up in their droves and suddenly it looks harder than it did. I guess my question to you is, how do you stay the course on that against what will be massive opposition? Yes, 80%, 87% will say negative. They agree with you doing something with negative gearing, but the 13% who don't will marshal their resources in ways that you can only imagine, I'm sure. So I guess I'm just interested in, have you thought through how implementation is going to work, and are you committed to doing it quickly? Because I think the experience would say if you don't do it in the first 12 months, then you won't do it in your first term either.
Thanks, Anne. I think the answer to that is we've not just talked about tax reform, we've not just said we'll engage in tax reform, we haven't said what has been a formula from opposition for some years, and I think a most unfortunate one, just vote for us and we'll fix it. We have outlined a very detailed plan. Negative gearing, capital gains tax, superannuation, managing tax affairs, tax rates, I mean, all out there. Now, in many instances, we will have taken those policies to 2 elections, the last one and the next one. And nobody has, frankly, laid a glove on those policies and their technical implementation. Not everybody agrees with them, but nobody has been able to say that won't work, you can't do that. And they haven't been written on the back of an envelope. They've been 2 years of work, for example, went into designing the negative gearing and capital gains tax reforms. And that gives us a mandate. I'm not suggesting all will be easy, but when I go to the senators and say, listen, you might not like every aspect of the policies, but we fought 2 elections on them, there's a clear mandate for action here. I think that stands us in good stead. People argue that the age of reform is over and reform's too hard. Well, reform is not too hard, it can't be too hard, but you have to have the moral authority of a mandate to go with that reform and to say we fought and won an election on these things and now we're going to implement them, and we will implement them expeditiously in our first budget, will be what we do. So it's true to say that you get the vested interests out, but we've been through that. And I don't mind telling you, when I took negative gearing and capital gains tax reform to the Shadow Cabinet, for example, I warned them that we might be facing a mining tax-style ad campaign within a fortnight, but that we should absolutely do this. Now, some of them might have thought I'd lost touch with reality, but we've fought one election on them, we'll fight another election on them, the vested interests have given it their best shot, and we've won the debate.
The Buffett tax, huge support for it as a broad way to capture the appetite against inequality, but it's a pretty blunt hammer. Are there ways you think across all those reforms effectively a Buffett tax which enables the real capture of progressive tax without the unintended consequences?
Sure. Again, I understand the sentiment behind a Buffett rule. I understand what drives that argument. As I point out, though, it's not actually a Buffett tax or a Buffett rule, it's a Buffett concept because it hasn't been done anywhere. It's not actually the policy of any mainstream progressive party in the world. And there's reasons for that. Because while it might be an attractive principle, when you actually look at how you would implement it, it's not workable. For example, whether we like it or not, a lot of charitable and philanthropic organisations rely on donations from high net worth individuals. And you might want to take a punt that those donations will continue without them being tax deductible, but that's a very big punt to take. And then you've got talked about innovation, but the importance of investment in startups and venture capital and high risk enterprises, which many will fail, and there's a tax there's a tax concession for investing in something which has failed. But if you get rid of all that, then you're taking a backward step when it comes to innovation and agility. And so the better approach is the one we've taken, carefully identifying the tax concessions which are regressive and reforming them. And you do it properly and you do enough of it, you get to a similar space. But you don't have the unintended consequences of risking Australia's charitable sector and venture capital sectors. And a few years ago people would have said, as you said, no political party will touch negative gearing, capital gains is too hard, super's too much of an issue. And the debate has changed. And we're up for those debates where we can confidently answer questions about the consequences and say, look, we've thought that through. There won't be an impact on charities. There won't be an impact on venture capital because we're carefully designing our reforms, is what we can say. We can't say that about a buffer tax. But improving the equity, as I've said in my remarks, improving the equity and progressivity of our tax system is right at the top of the agenda.
Chris, in terms of, and this perhaps touches on what you've just been saying, but in terms of the universality of the Medicare levy, I mean, Bill Shorten's been copping some stick about wanting to put a higher levy on high-income earners. But having watched Richard Di Natale blunder around on Insiders last weekend, trying to address the non-payment by high-income earners of the existing Medicare levy, wouldn't it be appropriate to consider the application of the Medicare levy on gross income rather than net or taxable income? Because that does seem to be where the problem is arising.
Well, again, while I understand that sentiment, I think the better approach is to reduce the opportunities to reduce your taxable income through inappropriate concessions. And that's the better approach. You pay Medicare levy then on a much better reflection of your real income. If you did it the other way, again, you're going to have similar sorts of issues about the importance of charitable donations, etc. So the problem arises in the capacity to reduce your taxable income right down to something very little. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm obsessed with negative gearing, even though a little bit I am, but the Treasurer likes to say, oh, look, people who negatively gear, their taxable income's under $80,000. Now, I suspect he actually understands why that's the case, and it doesn't suit his argument. Their taxable income is under $80,000 because they've deducted the hell out of their income and got it below $80,000 when their gross income is very high. So that rather underlines our point rather than undermines it. So the key is changing the tax concessions so that you can't do that. Can't do that as easily.
Thank you very much. Hello, Chris. Melina Morrison from the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals. You've spoken a lot about the importance of tax reform and a fairer wages system for distributing fairness and equality throughout society. There's a tradition in Labor through distributed ownership models like cooperatives and mutuals, friendly societies, credit unions, in fact the genesis of collective bargaining, of Labor being able to hire capital through distributed ownership. And I'm wondering if you've thought about what Labor could do to stimulate that more diverse ownership models in the economy.
Well, in general terms, and I recognise the work that your organisation's done in this regard, and there have been good parliamentary inquiries which you've participated in, which have looked at different options, which I think have made sort of sensible recommendations, which I would take on board as Treasurer. So I think it can play a role. I wouldn't suggest it would be, to be frank, wouldn't be at the centrepiece of our economic agenda, but it can play a role with appropriate government regulation to make it as sensibly easy as possible to engage in ownership structures which are suitable for that social policy objective.
Hi, Chris. I love all your suggestions about improving the income tax system through tackling the deductions and concessions. But at the start, you said that wealth inequality had actually got worse than income inequality has. So I was wondering, have you any thoughts about having a look at some wealth taxes?
Well, look, to be clear, I mean, people are entitled to aspire to be wealthy. We have nothing wrong with that, providing they're paying fair tax along the way. I think that's the essential way of looking at it. If they're paying fair tax along the way, we're making our tax system more progressive and we're getting more of the income as it's being created. Again, I come down on the side that that's a better approach than taxing the wealth after it's created. I want to see all income taxed fairly and taxed in a way which is not distorting decisions that people make, but is funding and activist, appropriate, social policy, health policy and education policy. I think that's the better way of doing it, and hence you've seen us taking that approach with all the tax concessions that we have indicated will reform. And while I understand the sentiment driving calls for a wealth tax, I think our model is the better way of dealing with it.
Per Capita Board Member Jeff Gall.
Good afternoon, Premier.
Good afternoon. Chris, budget repair. You've made a very good case that a part of budget repair must be more progressivity in our tax system. You create revenue to that effect and that gets put into the pile. Is that enough to deal with budget repair? Because obviously last time round Wayne Swan got into a bit of trouble with his predictions on growth would bring the budget back into balance. The current government's having the same problem with their projections. So it raises the issue as to whether or not expenditure cuts are needed. So we've got more progressivity in the tax system to create revenue. We've got to make a reasonable assumption about growth. But it just seems to me on the expenditure side, given that when you're sitting in that chair as the Treasurer, will you be looking to have expenditure cuts, or do you think is that a necessity to get back to budget repair?
I think, Jeff, they are both part of the budget repair equation. This is the difference between the present Treasurer and myself. He, up until recently, has argued it could all be done by expenditure cuts. And I've said that that's nonsensical, but it would also be nonsensical to suggest it could all be done by tax. If you look at where we are placed now compared to, say, 2002, mid-year of budget surplus cycles, expenditure is running higher than it was then, and revenue is running lower. They've both led to structural deficits. And so both need to be part of the equation. Now, both sides, supporting each other, have taken out some of that upper middle class welfare that John Howard built in during the boom years. We've supported them doing it, and they've supported us doing it. They haven't always supported us doing it. They opposed us abolishing the baby bonus, for example, but nevertheless, there has been some progress there. And we went to the last election proposing some expenditure cuts, which the government has now adopted, and some which they may yet still adopt. They adopted a slightly different method, but they adopted the principle of dealing with vocational education and training help, for example, which we announced, a substantial expenditure saving. We announced at the last election some reforms to private health insurance rebate, for example, an expenditure saving. What you won't get is me saying revenue can do it all or expenditure can do it all. I would say a sensible, balanced approach looks at both of them.
Hi, thanks. Actually, just got a question going back to the wealth tax thing. And part of it is coming from ignorance. I don't actually understand how the system works in terms of how inequality is actually created. But the examples that you gave at the beginning around inequality, about the 1% owning so much, I would have assumed actually came from actually wealth creation, right? So you've given examples of where equality is being created within the system in terms of wealth creation, but I don't actually see the examples that you've given in terms of taxation and other areas of reform addressing that level of inequality.
Well,
so I'd love an understanding of that wealth tax further and what your position is on that with respects to the arguments that you gave for inequality at the beginning.
So income inequality is a real issue. And income inequality leads then to wealth inequality and worsens wealth inequality. Income inequality is at elevated levels. And that means you make your tax system more progressive as part of the policy response, as well as those labour market, workplace relations-based reforms that I was talking about, which are very important as well. Now, by dealing with those, you suggested that some of our policies don't deal with it, but in fact they do. They do, because where the tax system is regressive, it's in reinforcing income inequality, which then leads to elevated wealth inequality. So the tax concessions are very substantial in Australia. I mean, we're not talking about small beer. We're talking about big buckets of money, which are being handed from one taxpayer to another, and far too often from a low-income taxpayer to a high-income taxpayer through the tax concessions. I mean, we have a very complicated tax system in Australia. The second most complicated in the world after the United States is our tax system. We don't have sort of flat rates and minimum deductions. We have lots of deductions and higher rates. Now, what we're dealing with the deductions, which are uniquely Australian. Only Australia and New Zealand have negative gearing, for example. And the New Zealand Labor Party just announced they'll get rid of it if they win the election. Slightly different policy to ours. We're keeping it for new properties. They're getting rid of it over 5 years. But we're the only two countries with it. And other economies, bundle along okay without negative gearing. And last time I checked, the United States had quite a healthy rental market without negative gearing. So these are big and important elements of our tax system. And the capital gains tax concession is arguably the most progressive of all. The most progressive of all. And that goes very much to wealth creation, not just income. The capital gains tax concession is the most progressive of all of them, is growing at a rapid rate and is allowed to continue uninhibited. So it's got to be reformed.
Thanks a lot, Chris. My name's Troy. I'm doing my PhD on basic income, so I'm quite interested in that topic at the University of Sydney.
I hope you've still got a research topic, mate, after.
Oh, I certainly do. And I
didn't mean to stuff your plans up.
Two very quick points. One is that if you do have a progressively structured UBI, you'll not be paying millionaires a UBI. I mean, you'll obviously be taxing back more through the tax system than you're giving them through the transfer system. So it can still be a progressive outcome. But I take your point, it can be very expensive, very high degree of churn. So what I'd hope is that for heavy hitters in the Labor Party, if you're the next Treasurer and Andrew Lee's there as the Assistant Treasurer, that you'd look at negative income tax models for basic income that don't have a lot of those issues that you identified as being problems with the most generous model. That's the one point I'd say on UBI. And then my question goes to jobs, and you mentioned the very high level of youth unemployment in Cairns and elsewhere. And I'm wondering how you think beyond the tax reform and the education reforms that are all fantastic, what about more public investment to boost aggregate demand?
Well-targeted public investment, sure, absolutely, with a positive economic return as well. And that can be done. I mean, we talk about the importance of infrastructure, which I haven't really focused on much today, but we talk about the importance of infrastructure for economic efficiency and productivity, quite rightly, because it's one of the very big levers that we have, but it also happens to create a lot of jobs along the way as it's being built. And if it's focused on areas where it has maximum impact, then I'm all in favour of it. Absolutely.
Okay, one final question.
Morning, Chris. My name is Roger Tonkin. At the start, you contrasted the economy, globally and in Australia, in 2015, in 1915 with the situation now, both in terms of inequality and the industrial revolution environment then with the new technology revolution now. But another major change has been, over that time, globalisation. Capital and populations are now much more mobile now than they were then. In that context, is it realistic to expect that a small trading open economy such as Australia can quarantine itself from the levels of inequality that exist in our major trading countries, partners?
Yes, it is, Roger. Thanks for the question, but yes, it is. It has to be. Otherwise, we all might as well just give up the ghost and go home, particularly those of us who, do this for a living. I refer to one of my earlier speeches, the case for openness. I've thought a lot about globalisation and its impacts on Australia and the positive benefits it's had and what we need to do to ensure that those benefits are fairly shared. But governments matter and sovereign national governments matter, and what we do in relation to tax matters. I take your point to this degree. We could let it be an excuse. We could say, oh, look, yeah, sure, we'd love to, have a top marginal tax rate of 49.5%, but hey, we wouldn't be globally competitive. It'd just be used as an excuse. Oh, Donald Trump, God bless him, reduced the corporate tax rate to 15%, so must we. Well, of course we must care about global competitiveness, yeah, absolutely. But we should not let it be an excuse for inaction. And it doesn't mean we necessarily all follow a race to the bottom. So I guess my answer is, well, it's possible that you could allow it to be. We should not let it be an excuse for dealing with increasing income inequality.
That's a pretty good note to finish things on, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for your informed questions from the floor. I will wrap things up pretty quickly. I know most of you need to get back to work, but thank you again for coming today. The Shadow Treasurer alluded in his speech to the impact on small non-profits and other charitable organisations if we were to do away with tax concessions. I would remind all of you that any support for per capita is fully tax deductible. I know some of you have made some generous donations when buying for your tickets for today, so thank you very much. But the work that we do, we've got the tax survey coming out next week, an upcoming report on things that we can do to help the ageing workforce in an increasingly casualised employment environment, and various other bits and pieces of work coming out through the rest of the year. I know that those in this room are our greatest supporters, but do share our work widely, and if you or any of your nearest and dearest are so inclined, we would love to see your further support for our work. So on that note, always self-interest at the end, thank you again, all of you, for coming. I'd like to, a couple of gifts here. Firstly, to say thank you to Jacob Varghese for hosting us here today. Thank you, Jacob. And of course to the Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen. Thank you for a really interesting address today. And thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.